So this is our fourth seminar on Benedict. And so the idea of this seminar is really, really from his demission, or from his stepping down from the papacy. And I wanted to, what I thought we could do also, and this is a specific issue that I think is worth addressing. I was actually asked last night. We were at a cookout, and one of the undergraduates said to me, I was just having this conversation with an Orthodox Jewish student here at Harvard, and I had never heard about any arguments for the recognition of the state of Israel. And so I just listened to this lady, who's a fellow senior, give me her arguments. And she spoke about the biblical, like one argument she gave was the biblical promise given to Moses, right? That we deserve a nation. A second argument was we were good at putting together the financial resources to buy the land. And then the third argument was every ethnic group deserves its land, deserves its own nation and government. And so he asked me kind of what I thought about all this. And in Que cosa el cristianismo, this is the posthumous writings now of Benedict, which I don't know if it's come out yet in English.
I don't believe anything.
I don't think, but I know that that immediately there were unofficial translations that were done into English of the book. And so there's this one dialogue in the book between Benedict. It's a series of letters back and forth between Benedict and Rabbi Folger of Vienna. And so I thought it'd be interesting just to, try to approach. I think it's important to do it here at Harvard, because the Harvard faculty is 40% Jewish, right? And the undergraduate population is, I think there's as many Jewish people here as there are Catholics, right? It's like they're represented I just saw the chart this week. They're represented 1,000 times more than their percentage of the population at Harvard. Because there's I think this is just interesting to understand, because Benedict on the one hand he's there at the Second Vatican Council. He's part of writing Nostra Aetate. The church is making this effort since the Second Vatican Council of a kind of, is there a new approach we can have in dialogue with the Jews, right? On the other hand, I think I'm trying to figure out exactly how to characterize. I think when we get to his dialogue back and forth with this Rabbi Folger, you see some of the tensions even in the new approach, and of course also so on the one hand, it seems to me that there's maybe three things that are happening that is good for us to kind of keep in mind as we approach this particular topic. And this is the topic I'd like to really address this final class, is Catholic-Jewish relations, as Benedict discusses it in Que cosa el cristianismo, but also there's other moments in his life where he's dealt with this, right? And of course, the first thing, I was thinking of some images, some things from my own experience, and then even a news report that happened this morning, right? As far as trying to kind of give a little bit of a context of this. So number one, I had this great friend at Notre Dame who grew up in a secular Jewish family. And when he was hired at Notre Dame, about a month in, that we had a little seminar on Fides et Ratio, like we're doing today, just a small group of professors and graduate students. So we were going to have a discussion on Fides et Ratio. And we were walking together to the seminar, and he was turning red, and he was sweating. And I said, Michael, what's up? Are you sick? Are you okay? He said, look, this will be my first ever discussion on faith and reason with Catholics. And I never really practiced Judaism, but all my memories as a kid from the rabbis, from my synagogue, whatever, were basically horror stories. I was told all these horror stories, right? And all these horror stories, and it's not, he says there's nothing that I've experienced, but all, because he was older than me, much older than me. He had many very good Catholic friends who were scholars and whatnot. He said, but all these horror stories that I heard as a child, they're coming back to me now, and I just fear, like this fear is just rising up within me, and I fear what might happen, being in a group where I'm like the only Jewish guy with all these Catholics around me, talking about faith and reason. He was in absolute fear, right? And he overcame his fear, and we had the discussion. And after the discussion, he said, wow, I taught at a secular university for 30 years. There was more academic freedom in that discussion than anything I've ever seen, right? At my other university. But just the thing that really struck me, and I think that Ratzinger, from the time of the Second Vatican Council and Nostra Aetate, and also I think from the way that he benefited from philosophical insights from people like Martin Buber, other Jewish intellectuals of the mid-20th century, I think when he's speaking about Catholic-Jewish relations, I think that image of my professor, like, how do you overcome these like deep-seated historical fears that obviously there might be something that happened in the past which has been magnified or discussed or thought about, right? That, like, how do you, so when you're engaged in dialogue, and the whole point of dialogue, right, is how do you meet somebody and overcome those fears, right? So that you can engage in a dialogue that could open that person up to Jesus Christ, ultimately. And so I think when he's speaking about Catholic-Jewish dialogue, I think that experience that I had with my other professor, and I think he's had some of his own, right? I think he's thinking about that. And obviously, he also, we will see in these letters with Folger, he's also saying that part of the idea in the 1960s is how do we deal with the Holocaust, right? And how do we reinitiate Catholic-Jewish dialogue in a way that's non-threatening in the light of the Holocaust? So like the Holocaust would be the most recent event, right? That could be a real cause of, leading to a kind of fear in the spirit of the person that would lead the person to be blocked off from a dialogue that could have ultimately lead to maybe accepting Christ, or maybe not, right? But obviously, so, and this also may be where some of these phenomenologists, like after Heidegger, Levinas, Buber, Paul Ricoeur, right? I was just talking yesterday. I went to the beach yesterday, and we were talking at the beach a little bit about this with a graduate student at BC, and we were talking about how, that this is my one gesture to Pius in his absence. No, but that Heidegger, Levinas, Buber, there is even Aquinas at the beginning of the Summa Contra Gentiles. Aquinas says there's two ways to approach God, right? One way to approach God is a kind of deontological approach where first you prove that there is God, and then after you prove that there is God, you prove his qualities, you show that he's a creator, you show how he creates, you show what he creates, and how that creates an order, a moral order even, that everyone should follow.
That's more or less the Summa.
That's the first two books of the Summa Contra Gentiles, right? Which is his book. And actually, I don't know if you know this, but I'll say it so in case now you will know it, right? That there was this real effort, right? There was this real effort in Spain after the rediscovery of the Talmud in the 12th century. There was this real effort in Spain. I think it was a genuine good effort of how do we do apologetics with Muslims and Jews and lead them to Christ. There were errors that were made in that effort. Some of the reasons for the effort was that there was irrational violence that would break out, right? So you got to deal with that. but also how do you lead them to Christ? And so St. Raymond Pennyfort, he asked Aquinas to write something that would help in Jewish, Muslim, and Catholic dialogue. And what Aquinas produced for that was the Summa Contra Gentiles, right? And what he says in the Summa Contra Gentiles, he says this in the beginning of it, in the preface. He says, when you're in this kind of dialogue with Jews and Muslims at the same time, you don't have any, like if you're just dealing with the Jewish people, you have the Torah, you at least hold the Torah in common with them. The Talmud, no, right? But the Torah, yes. So you can at least go from there. But with Muslims, it's not even clear that we have the Torah in common, right? So in the Summa Contra Gentiles, he says we have to use reason alone in order to start the dialogue with Jews and Muslims, right? Now, Aquinas' Summa Contra Gentiles, it was not the bestseller of the 12th century for how to engage in Jewish-Muslim dialogue. The bestseller in Spain was Pugno Fidei, right? The dagger of faith. I forget the guy's name now, but it was a very more hardcore, like intellectually, like.
Is that seen also in the imagery of the cross?
Yeah. But so in the third book of the Summa Contra Gentiles, Aquinas says, okay, I've shown you like the top-down approach for how to approach God and how to approach man. Now what I'm going to do is the much more difficult, much more painstaking approach, which can be full of errors and you can make mistakes and it might be hard to bring people along, but I'm going to start from man, and from man we're going to go up to God. And it's very interesting because like the first two books of the Summa Contra Gentiles, each of them is like, I think 80 questions long, more or less. The third book is like 120 questions long because it's a much more complicated, like it's not, you can make mistakes, it's complicated. Like also, how do you get people to come on board? What if someone's blocked? It's a little bit also like, it's a little bit, this is an image that I found helpful. I've always found helpful in dealing with couples, that you're like these two sides of the triangle. You're both, by the way, I think Xavier is about to come in and he might you're like the two sides of the triangle and you're both going towards God, right? But someone could come here, someone could get a little bit more advanced and the other one could be kind of here. And you kind of got to wait for the other person, right? You kind of got to wait for the other person to get here before you can both keep going towards God together, right? There is that dance, which is part of growing together, going in the same direction. And so this also can happen so I think that this is what Aquinas is saying, that this is part of the difficulty, dealing with the subjectivity of the other person, not in a relativistic sense, right? Not in the sense of subjectivism or relativism of, well, everything goes, but just in the sense of, right, classical pedagogy. How do you meet people where they are to draw them where you want them to be, right? And so this is where Heidegger, Levinas, Buber, Ricoeur, they all give this emphasis to how do you value the other, right? How do you enter into the subjectivity of the other and understand that for what it is? Right? And understand that that's part of reality. And that's, obviously there might be limits to that, but there is, you can understand how someone could look at neo-scholasticism and could say it's so objective, right? It's so objective from the top down. And a lot of neo-scholasticism of the late 19th, early 20th century, it did give a greater emphasis, you might say, to the equivalent of the first two books of the Summa Contra Gentiles, as opposed to book 3, right? The approach of book 3. So I say that to say that the kind of the question that's always kind of in the back of my mind, and then this is the other aspect that we want to bring up, that I want to bring up, is that while I understand, I guess here's the question that I have in my mind. I don't have a resolution to the question. I think actually the whole approach to Catholic-Jewish relations, it makes a lot of sense to me. Like if it's if it's for you and me, and how are we going to deal with Jewish people at Harvard, let's say? What seems to me more difficult is how do you deal with, I also think I understand, like, okay, how is the Catholic Church officially going to engage in dialogue officially with rabbis who have a kind of official representation, right? Because that's always got to be done in a diplomatic way, right? Or the state of Israel, right? You know, you have to be very, like, again, the diplomats that I knew in Rome, they always impressed upon me, and I understand it, that, you know, some guy in the United States says something about another religion, and in Sri Lanka, 10 Catholics get killed, you know, or, you know, some guy in the United States who says he's Catholic says something about Judaism, and then all of a sudden in Israel, there's a breakout again of Christian violence, you know, by more radical types, right? So the church is, I think we always have to keep this in mind, that a lot of times we're immersed in very specific things in our country or in our society, and the church has to deal with some of these issues in a more universal way. And the church is very, I think, attuned to, and I saw it when I was living in Rome, that how, especially as the world gets smaller, how someone says something in one country and it could be received in a completely different way in another country. And of course, in every country, there's a different religious, social, cultural balance that's part of the common good in each place. So I think, I'll just say these things. So even this morning, I opened the news this morning, and Ron DeSantis was in New Hampshire yesterday, doing a fundraiser. You know, he might want to run for president, so he's in New Hampshire trying to meet the people. He's at a dinner, an exclusive private dinner, and these activists rush into the dinner, and they start holding up signs and chanting. Basically, Ron DeSantis is not Jewish, or Ron DeSantis is against Jewish values. And now, why are they doing that? They're doing that because Ron DeSantis is proposing laws in Florida to limit abortion, right? And at this point, there are 400 different Jewish organizations that have intervened in Florida, basically saying there should be no limits on abortion. Right. And the mantra that these groups have adopted is abortion is a Jewish value. So they're actually saying, these groups are saying, this is like this is part of our religion. And so therefore you have to accept it. And if you don't accept it, you're an anti-Semite, right? If you don't accept this. And then the other thing, and I know this is like absurd, right? But I saw this article this week, and I wasn't like looking for these things. I just saw the article that this ordained rabbi, started a company called the Something for Ethical Commitments. It was like it was like the Committee of Ethical Commitments.
Yeah, I think I saw this too.
And this committee bought Pornhub. So now you have a situation where you have an ordained rabbi, who is the CEO of a company that's going to be running the biggest pornography provider in the world. It seems to me there's three dynamics, right? One dynamic is the personal dynamic of how we deal with individuals. Another dynamic is the dynamic of the church dealing in a kind of official capacity with nations or with groups that are the representatives of the Jewish people, right? But Judaism is it seems to me it's a little bit like Protestantism, and that it's kind of hard to identify, obviously if there's a rabbi who's like the rabbi of the synagogue of Rome, okay, you know who that is. But these 400 groups, they're all claiming that they're Jewish groups in one way or another. And they claim to have a certain representative status. And of course, I think we as Catholics, we know very well by our experience. There's the church, there's the bishops, right? In fact, we kind of all know very well, like you just don't criticize the bishops. Or if you do offer a criticism, it has to be in a certain way, in a certain, forum, with kind of delicacy, understanding, distinguishing between persons and ideas. So the question that this is like how I keep coming back to that when as we discuss this issue, these three different dynamics, like how they work. And we may have, I think a lot of times in the United States, since there's a Jewish population, which is very active politically on both sides of the political spectrum. Like this fellow that I was talking to last night, he said half of his Jewish friends here at Harvard are super anti-Israel, right? They're super because leftist progressive Jewish people tend to be more pro-Palestinian and anti-Israel. And there's huge protests going on right now in Israel, trying to bring down the government, and it's being mostly led by the progressive leftist types. And they're like, I had a friend in graduate school who grew up in Israel. His dad was one of the leaders of the Communist Party in Israel, right? He grew up in a kibbutz. And initially, he was not supposed to, his kibbutz was so communist in its origin, in its ideals, that initially he was not supposed to even know who his parents were, right? Because the idea is they were trying to do the women and children in common, of communism of old. It was actually kind of funny when he described to me what happened. He said, they started out like as really good communists, right? They all were on board. This was back in the 60s, right? We're all on board. We don't want to know our children. We'll have these special workers who will be the workers who raise the children. And this was like the system. And then after a couple of years of this, some of the women got together and they made a petition to the leadership of the kibbutz. And they said, we want to be like, we believe in communism. Communism is awesome. It's great. And we fully believe in it. But could we just know could each one of us know who's my child? Right? So just to follow, right? Just to follow, But they had this big debate about it, and then they decided, okay, yeah, the woman, like we're gonna still do the communism. The workers are gonna raise the kids who are the kid workers and everything. But the women they can just observe their child from a distance. And that went on for a couple of years, and then the women got together again, and they made a new petition. Could we maybe just bring the one that's my child, could we bring it to our house just once a week, maybe like on the Sabbath? Could we bring our child to our house on the Sabbath just for a meal, just to get to know him a little bit, a little bit. And then that was debated for a couple of years, and then that got granted. And then there were like 4 or 5 more steps. But in the end, every kid lived at home with his parents and went to the kibbutz school, right, during the week. So human nature, right, has its way of always kind of coming back. But so my friend was, his position was, and he's back in Israel now. He's part of the progressive left in Israel. He's a professor at Tel Aviv University. But his position was, there should just be one state and like one man, one vote. Like he thought that's the way to resolve this issue. So, but then, this guy was telling me also, yes, he has also a good number of friends here who are very like, Israel needs its nation, right? That's just it's a religious and political requirement of the modern world. So with that in mind, I want to go to Benedict's comments. And I want to go to them kind of thinking, are they limited to these two dynamics that I spoke of? Could they be helpful for the third dynamic? And I don't have an answer to that question. My sense is that they're not so helpful for this third dynamic, but maybe they, so anyway, so Ratzinger, one of the things he writes in his memoir, right? The Church of Rome has made it clear that Christians and Jews worship the same God and the holy books of Israel, and are also the holy books of Christendom. Abraham's faith is also the faith of Christians. Abraham is also for them father in faith. I think this is like just classical Catholic teaching, right?
St. Paul.
Yeah, right. There's the church is to ultimately tease it out, right? The covenant, which is made with Abraham before the establishment of the Abrahamic covenant. This would almost be a great discussion to have with Pius here, and then next year when Suan arrives. So because one of them is, I learned in the emails back and forth that one of them is Second Temple Judaism, and the other one is Post-Temple Judaism. And it'd be interesting just to have them here because that's one of the things they're interested in. So maybe next fall we'll. But anyway, it just seems to me that that this is just classical Catholic teaching, that the Lord promises Abraham, you will have descendants more numerous than the grains of sand on the seashore. I will make of you a great nation. Right? And then he makes a second, you might say he makes a second or another iteration of a covenant with Abraham after the circumcision, where he says, I will give you a land. And then in the book of Joshua, at the end of Moses, in the book of Joshua, in the book of Nehemiah, those are the three places I can remember off the top of my head, they say the Lord has fulfilled his promise that he made to Abraham. Right? He's given us the land. Right? And so then St. Paul deals with this in Romans and in Galatians. So it seems like this statement, I think he's reflecting on his life, is very standard. In a private book in 1998, the problem seems to me to come up with, like in Catholic Jewish dialogue, like I think the problem that comes up is, and especially in the context of, let's say, the state of Israel, what's the status of the Mosaic covenant, right? And should there be a state that embodies the entirety of the Mosaic covenant? And again, I think I would come down on that. My reading of Paul in Romans and Galatians and Hebrews 8 would be that, no, you can't have that. But I think this is where, like, there's in 1998, he wrote in a private book. So in 1998, he writes, Paul makes a firm disjunction between the covenant in Christ and the Mosaic covenant. This is how we usually understand the difference between the Old and the New Covenant. Paul's sharpest contrast between the two testaments is to be found in 2 Corinthians 3 and Galatians 4. Whereas the term New Covenant, I would add to that Hebrews 8. Right? But I can understand maybe why he didn't there. But whereas the New Covenant comes from prophecy and so forms a link between both parts of the Bible, the expression Old Covenant occurs in 2 Corinthians 3:14. And then in Que Cosa el Cristianismo, when he's in dialogue with Folger, Rabbi Folger in Vienna, he says, maybe we need new clarity on the fact that the moral teaching in the Old and New Testaments is ultimately identical, and that here there cannot be any substitution, right? So I think Folger basically says to Ratzinger, I don't like the substitution theology of the New Testament, that the New Covenant has superseded the Old Covenant, right? I don't like that term. Folger says, I don't like that term. And that seems to be part of Catholic teaching. And so Ratzinger says, well, maybe we need new clarity on that point, right? So I think this is one of the moments where so my interpretation of this is, he's basically saying, okay, if you have, I'm kind of trying to read between the lines a little bit here. If because of the Holocaust, now I think there's actually a second, I want to say, if because of the Holocaust, if because of the Holocaust and what happened, and we're trying to reestablish Jewish-Catholic dialogue, if you have this fear that making too hard of a distinction between the Old Covenant and the New Covenant, if you have a fear that somehow that's what leads to violence, I'm willing to have a dialogue with you on maybe there's a new way to state that dynamic. I think that's probably what because someone I knew who worked with Ratzinger for many years, he's now Archbishop Charlie Brown. He said that when he was, his name is Charles Brown, yeah. But he said that when he was working with Ratzinger, it always struck him how a lot of the people on the CDF, they were always very insistent, like, we have to decide this, we have to condemn this person, we have to be clear. And that Ratzinger would always say, well, let's have one more round of dialogue, right? Let's have one more attempt, right, to have a conversation with this person and see if we could come to an understanding. And so my sense is that when Ratzinger is in this little dialogue with this Folger, Rabbi Folger in Vienna, which is replicated in the Kekosa, I think that's what he's saying here, right? I think he's saying that maybe there's a different way we could explain this dynamic without using language that's so hard. Folger doesn't take it in that way. So basically what he does is he said what Ratzinger does, before I get to Folger, what Ratzinger does is he says, he makes a little bit of he grants something to Folger that previously he had never said. So previously he had always kind of said, when talking about the Holocaust, that it was kind of a pagan ideology that was responsible for the Holocaust. In his little dialogue here with Folger, he says, Christian anti-Semitism is responsible for the rise of National Socialism in Germany, right? And I wonder, so this is something that is new for him. So the actual quote is, a dispute ensued. And I think what's interesting here is that for those who know a little bit about the Holocaust and the study of it, and also there's Norman Finkelstein he's a Jewish scholar whose parents died. I think they suffered in Auschwitz. They were in Auschwitz for a while. So Norman Finkelstein, especially beginning in the 1990s, Finkelstein becomes very critical of what he writes a book on it called The Holocaust Industry, where he basically says there's a difference between those who suffered and died in the Holocaust, and obviously we need to address how that happened and why that happened and how to correct it, and what's happening now here in the 1990s in the United States, and so he writes The Holocaust Industry because he says, and in that book his argument is, the further we get from the Holocaust, it seems like the more people there are that are trying to somehow claim some sort of connection to it in order to gain some political or economic advantage because they can claim a grievance connected with the Holocaust. And Finkelstein is super critical of that, right? And actually that in the late 90s, it was that group of people that began to accuse Christian anti-Semitism. It was the Holocaust industry of the 90s that began to come up with this dynamic of the Christian anti-Semitism is responsible for Nazism. This is also interesting because, again, the church, Civiltà Cattolica in 1889 wrote a series of articles on kind of the socio-economic state of Europe at the end of the 19th century. And in those articles, the church says, unless the Europeans come up with a solution to some of the injustices of the time, and then refers specifically to Germany, and says unless they resolve these things, only a leader will have to emerge, right? And warning, this would be a bad thing, right? A leader would emerge in order to resolve these problems, and it won't be good, right? So the church seems to me in the late 19th century to be warning the Europeans that there's all sorts of tendencies which, if you don't correct them, you're going to get problematic behavior. Now, I suppose another way, maybe the sense that I'm trying to understand what Benedict is meaning here, maybe what he's meaning here in his dialogue with Folger is that, well, just like in the Middle Ages, there were Christians involved in the pogroms against the Jews. Right? It wasn't that the church was teaching these things. The church was not encouraging pogroms, right? And the Jewish people knew this because whenever pogroms would break out, the first place the Jewish people would run to would be the castle of the bishop because they knew that the teaching of the church was you cannot force anybody to convert. You cannot do violence against anybody to try to bring about their conversion right? So the first place they would always run would be the castle of the bishop. And so maybe what he's saying here in the context of the dialogue is there were Christians who were, maybe he's writing things, but probably what he might mean is that there were Christians, again, this is a translation, it's not the official English, right? But maybe what he's trying to say is, just as in other times of history, there are Christians who were anti-Semitic, and they could have been involved in the rise of Nazism in Germany, So it's not the Christian teaching itself, right? But it could also be taken, and I think this is what the Rabbi Folger takes. He takes Ratzinger's statement in a different sense. I think he takes it more as you're saying that Catholic teaching itself, right, is what led to Nazism, kind of step by step somehow. And so here's Folger's response. First, he says, Catholic and Jews in this time are called to work together to preserve and maintain morality in the West. We're all in agreement with that, right? We can't disagree with that, right? Then he says, if I could dare ask someone from another faith to interpret its doctrines one way or the other, right? But if I could say that, due to the concrete evil that was done to the Jews by Christians in the past for this reason, I'm going to make an exception here. And I'm going to, precisely to strengthen the contrary thesis, I'm going to say that the never revoked covenant, which is now held in great consideration in the church, and which, according to his vision, should never be considered otherwise. So what Folger is saying, he's saying, you, Ratzinger, you have said we need new clarity on the relationship between the new covenant and the old covenant. You have said now that the church is teaching. So he's adding a little bit. I think he's adding a little bit. He's implying something from Ratzinger's statements that might not be in Ratzinger's statements, right? But he's drawing conclusions because there's a little bit of like ambiguity, right? Because Ratzinger says we need new clarity on the relationship between the old covenant and the new covenant. And then he's saying, yeah, maybe Catholicism, maybe anti-Christian Semitism was partly responsible for Nazism. So now Folger is saying, he's assuming the conclusion. So now you're saying the Mosaic covenant has never been revoked, and it should never be considered otherwise. Folger now says about Ratzinger, so now you're maintaining that the church has never really believed the theory of substitution. Right, so Ratzinger, he's kind of saying to Ratzinger, is that what you're saying? But then Folger says, but when I look at the church, I think that it is part of the historical views of the church. It's part of its oldest teachings. On the other hand, it is not permissible to forget the story and argue that in truth, everything was always going well because the criminals were presumably supporters of an erroneous theology. So now Folger is making the claim, right, that the people who were anti-Semitic, they were being held up in their anti-Semitism by an erroneous theology, which was the theology that there's two covenants, right? So,
can I ask a quick question?
Yeah.
Does this dialogue happen before or after? It must be before Benedict's book, Many Religions, One Covenant.
This dialogue takes place in 2018.
Oh, okay. Oh, wow. This was after.
The letters are in Que Cosa el Cristianismo.
Oh.
But this is Folger's response to Benedict. We don't have how he would respond back. Right? I mean, we have Ratzinger's first letter to Folger.
Right.
Folger responds back,
Okay.
and then we don't get a response from Benedict.
I see.
But then Folger goes on then to use this image of the Judensau. The Judensau was an image of a pig that was put in some German cities, was put in front of, it was like, for example, this image was put across the street from the bank that the Rothschilds owned. Basically to warn Christians, right? Like, if you go here, you might be in trouble, right? I mean, that was kind of the idea. So Folger responds back to Benedict, and he says, today the Jewish pigs on German churches and the church and synagogue statues on the facade of Strasbourg Cathedral are as much reminiscent of a dark past as today's relations of peace and friendship. It is not permissible to forget the story and argue that in truth everything was always going well because the criminals were presumably supporters of an erroneous theology. let's not water down the story. God forbid. It would be very important for us, together with your thesis, according to which the church could never support the thesis of the replacement of the Jewish people. I think there he's also using a new charged word, the replacement of the Jewish people. We never, that almost has like genocidal type, to also recognize that in certain times, many Christians nevertheless supported the thesis of the replacement against, therefore, the authentic doctrine of the church, and thus justified an unspeakable pain. So I think Folger, he's taking some liberties so it seems to me Benedict was always a man who was he was an academic. He was always very gracious. He was always willing to concede as much as he could to the person in an effort to try to bring this person into dialogue. And it seems to me, looking at this, that Folger, in the midst of this dialogue, he assumes that Benedict's willingness to say we need new clarity is basically a repudiation of the church's traditional teaching. I think Benedict, if he had the chance to respond, would say no.
I think of his book, it might have been 2006 he wrote this, I'm not sure. Many religions, one covenant, right?
Right.
It's a series of maybe
Right.
he gave, I forget the exact word, or exact genre, but he deals with the covenant and how there can be sort of one covenant to Abraham, and then how the Mosaic covenant fits inside that, and,
right?
And so on and so forth.
Yeah, my understanding is that the Mosaic covenant is like a second covenant. I mean, there's many covenants, right, in the Old Testament.
Right. Yeah.
You could say there's one that he makes Miskat Han, right? There's one with Adam and Eve. There's one with Noah. There's two with Abraham.
Joshua, yeah.
There's one with Moses. There's one with David. Maybe one with Joshua, right? I mean, so there's all these covenants, and so the question is, but obviously, ultimately, the full.
And there's the allusion to the new covenant.
The fulfillment of all the covenants is the new covenant. Right? That's the new covenant. The question is, right, to what degree, and obviously we're going to say that, right, Jesus, when he's talking with the rich young man, he basically says, live the commandments. Right? So we're going to say that.
And if I remember correctly, I have a minor personal interest in some of this as well. But even when St. Paul discusses it, it seems very much the question that's being discussed is whether or not the Mosaic covenant is necessary, especially for Gentile converts, but maybe in general for salvation, whether it's salvific.
Right.
And the answer, post fulfillment, post new covenant, is no.
Right.
Especially not for Gentile converts, but even for Jews, it's merely an act of personal piety. Right. Right. So, and that seems to be more or less the church's
that's right.
Subsequently.
That's right. And I think what Benedict is trying to do, I would say I think what Benedict is trying to do is he's trying to say there are good. We can value. There are. Like, I think this is a lot of the church's interreligious dialogue, not just with Judaism, but with all religions. There's something good in there, which is a seed that could develop into the gospel. And we want to try to value that seed. But we don't want to say that that seed itself is necessarily salvific.
Yeah.
Right? So we want to, but we don't want to make that distinction the first moment of the conversation. I think that's the best interpretation that we can give, right? But it opens up a little bit of the charge, right? This is always part of the dynamic since the 60s, right? It opens up the charge of, well, your openness to this dialogue, that must mean you're approving as somehow salvific your engagement with this person. Right, and then it seems like that, like in the case of Benedict with Folger, he didn't really respond. He didn't really get it. Maybe out of politeness, maybe because of lack of energy, maybe because of all sorts of reasons. He doesn't respond to Folger, so we don't see the distinctions that he might raise. Because it seems to me Folger, he starts playing a little bit with the terminology. right? And he makes a great leap when he says, well, if there were Christians who committed anti-Semitic actions, they were being bolstered by this old theology that you now need to repute. Like, basically, that's what Folger says. If there's Christians who committed anti-Semitic, and there are some, I know some theologians that they will interpret this exchange as, yeah, we need to do away with the old theology. We need to do away with the old distinctions completely.
Or
Right?
even I've heard the idea that there's no pressing need for conversion when it comes to those who
Right.
keep the Mosaic covenant.
Right. Yeah, there are some who argue that too.
Yeah.
Right, because they will say that the Mosaic covenant is salvific, but you can't say that. I mean,
No, it contradicts.
it would contradict so many things in Scripture.
Yeah, that's right.
Right? That it would make the whole New Testament meaningless again.
Yeah.
Yeah, like, doesn't that just, like, you would think the evidence would overwhelm people, like the New Testament kind of scriptural evidence for the fact that there is a new covenant would overwhelm, it would sort of prevent people from marshalling these sorts of arguments.
Right.
But clearly it doesn't, so, like, what do they say in response to sort of Paul and
Yeah, no, so here, like the one image, the image of the vineyard. The vineyard will be taken from you and given to another.
Right.
Or Paul, when he speaks about you've been grafted on, right? Their branch has been, I forget the exact language now, right? But the image is their branch is now not part of the vine. You have been grafted on, you Christians, right? But you have to beware, because you could also lose what you've been grafted onto. And the vine is the vine of salvation, right? So all the image of the New Testament, it's really difficult to come up with a biblically based argument if you accept the New Testament of how they still have the self. In other words, it's one thing to say there are good elements there. It seems to me there's also an approach from when I was a kid. That the approach has always been better to encourage someone to live his religion and live it well, because that could lead him to Christ, rather than to abandon all religion and become some sort of a pagan. So better to encourage someone to live the Mosaic covenant, because by living it, he may come to see Jesus Christ, rather than saying, no, I'll just go out there and live like there's no God. Yeah. But when I was growing up, that was kind of that was like in Detroit. That was like what everybody was always encouraging. So there is this other element now. I think the other element is the cultural one, right? That what do you do when, like, what does Ron DeSantis do, right? When 400 Jewish groups are now petitioning in the state of Florida saying abortion is a fundamental Jewish value, right? And do you just, I mean, as a Catholic, so there is this in the abortion debate in particular, so just a little bit of background on this. And obviously Benedict is in a different set of circumstances than we might be in the United States. So Bernard Nathanson, I don't know if you ever heard of Bernard Nathanson, but he's the founder of NARAL. And he eventually converted to Catholicism. He was baptized. He gave up NARAL, gave up abortion industry, gave up everything. But Nathanson, in his autobiography, he wrote that when we were in the late 60s, when we were involved in promoting abortion in California and New York, we realized at one point that we were a bunch of, his quote of himself in his book is, we were a bunch of crazy secular Jews, right? And we understood also that all of our opponents were Catholics. So he said, we came up with a schema at that point, like a strategy. Every time we were going against a politician who was Catholic, we would make a point of being very respectful, but also saying that he is Catholic. So there was this one Catholic representative in California, Peter King. So whenever Nathanson and his buddies were in a forum or a debate or a legislative process with Peter King, they would say Peter King, the Catholic. Like because they said they said they said, Nathanson said, we knew that our position had no weight, but that if we didn't say anything about who we were, and we just said Peter King the Catholic, everybody would think that the pro-life position is just a Catholic one. It's not one that's based in reason, right?
And now it's
Now you say evangelical Christian or Christian in general or whatnot, right? Right, but
now maybe religious is enough.
Right, but what's interesting is that now the leaders of in Florida, these 400 Jewish groups, they're now all saying abortion is a Jewish value.
But it seems to me this is the same thing, because it's just you're trying to impose your religion on me, so I'll turn around and impose my religion on you.
It's much more radical than that, because it's one thing to say we have something that we're not permitted to do, therefore you can't coerce us into doing it. And another thing to say, we permit this, therefore you cannot forbid it to anyone. Which, if taken consistently, would mean that anything that the Jewish law permits, the state would not be able to forbid, because it would be a Jewish value.
Yeah.
But I don't think they're even serious enough for that. It just seems to me that this is the same sort of thing, wherein we're just going to paint you with the label of Catholic. We don't care what Catholicism means, but this is purely a tool in the arsenal. I don't think it's been thought out to the extent to which we have to be imposing Mosaic law in the United States. I think we have...
My guess is that these 400 Jewish organizations, they're probably more leftist.
They wouldn't care about Mosaic law.
Yes,
but
exactly.
They don't want to elucidate the principle, of course. It's just about abortion. That's like they move from that to we will now deploy Judaism. But obviously the fundamental conviction is about abortion.
Yes, of course.
They're not actually acting out of
they don't want
a profound sense of
Jewish values.
My sense is that part of this also has to do with my understanding a little bit of the history. There was a professor at Harvard who wrote like a very in the introduction to his book he was writing a political book, but and I'm blank. I say his name. I know I'll come up with his name again. But at the beginning of his book, I'm blanking on his name now. But anyway, at the beginning of his book, he wrote a great. For me, it was very helpful, saying that, look, in 1648, that's when the Jewish people decided we're going to come out of the ghetto, and that began a 300-year process of, well, how are we going to relate to the modern world? And there were fundamentalist factions, which were more the faction of we got to go back and relive the Mosaic law, like letter for letter, and we need a nation where we can live it. There was another faction that was more Thomistic, like Catholic Thomistic, like we can somehow mediate between the law and the modern world, and we can come up with some notion of faith and reason to kind of harmonize these things. And the third faction was much more of a faction of there's no way to mediate between the Mosaic law and the modern world. We just have to transform the whole religion and embrace the Enlightenment, embrace modernity completely. And this professor claimed that by 1950, the vast majority of Jewish synagogues in the United States had adopted that third position. So making Judaism a kind of just like family faith, but very little adherence to the Mosaic law, or very little, loosely kind of connected. But of course, in the foundation of the State of Israel, because of the way that Israeli politics works, and there still is a strong minority within Judaism of the more Mosaic law types. And of course, because of Israeli politics, those smaller parties can have a bigger influence in the government of the state. So my guess is that these activists who in Florida, or these 400 groups, they're probably coming more from maybe not uniquely from, but probably more of them are coming from this third faction, right? Because they will write, so for example, in Tikkun magazine, I think, is one of the representatives of this faction. After the Supreme Court homosexual marriage, I forget the, yeah.
Yeah.
But after that decision, they had a big article. They had a whole issue dedicated to how they brought about that decision, working from 2005 until 2015, influence in Washington, influencing various senators, so they described how they were like instrumental in bringing about that decision. And some of the rabbis that they mentioned in that article are rabbis whose names also pop up in Catholic Jewish dialogue in this country, right? So
how do we trust these people?
So
how do we trust the rabbi who's working for gay marriage to actually have about religion?
yeah, so that's what I'm talking about, like this third dynamic. Do these principles of dialogue that would work, you might say, in the dynamic of a personal friendship, do they work? They might work in some dealings of the church, Catholic Jewish relations, officially. Do they work in the cultural, political sphere in the U.S.? And I find it hard. I find it hard to see how they work in the U.S., right? Precisely for this reason. The rabbi that buys Pornhub.
Doesn't believe it, right?
Right? Does he? So I think part of it has to do with also that the faction that wins out within Judaism in the U.S. at least, they're very Talmudic, right? There's another dynamic that's going on there, which is the Talmud, which is how do you organize the religion without sacrifice, without the temple? Kind of how do you organize the religion when you don't have the Mosaic law as the predominant thing? What is it? So that's where I would say that a lot of what's in Nostra Aetate, a lot of what we read about Catholic Jewish dialogue, or that it's in this cultural political sphere in the U.S., it's just hard for me to see how that applies to this dynamic.
Can we go in the opposite direction and sort of say that because it seems like the conversation that Ratzinger has with Rabbi Folger, there's some amount of, he tries to take what Ratzinger has said, twist the meaning, and say, make essentially the argument for the salvific properties of the Mosaic Law. Is there an extent to which all this dialogue is potentially dangerous because it invites people who don't believe in Catholicism, don't believe in Christianity, to try to change the principles of the
Right.
church?
Especially popular understanding.
Yes.
That's one of the criticisms of Maritain. I think Maritain is the philosopher who's behind behind a lot of people's approach of the Second Vatican Council. And one criticism of Maritain is that his approach ends up being kind of naively up, because it assumes the kind of the good graces. So we were talking earlier about, I was saying earlier about this insight into the value of the other, the appreciation of the other, the desire to engage in dialogue with the other. At what point do you say, like even our Lord, there's a point where he says to the disciples, well, if they reject you, just dust off your feet and leave that town, right? It'll be harder for them on the day of judgment. Like, in other words, there is this point of, there's just one, I have a friend, whenever people ask him about, they'll say, well, what if I use this argument and this argument and this argument with my friend, and he still says no? Like, what should I say then? And my friend actually says to them, nothing. I mean, just in the sense of like, obviously you can maintain a kind of friendship with a person, right? But there does come a point where you might have to say to somebody, look, I've said all I can say to you. I've given you everything I can say to you about the Gospels. And you know enough to where you either accept it or reject it, but I can't really say anymore. St. Josemaria would do that with people, where he would there were some people that he would become aware that, like when he was a young priest, he would see behavior in some people where they were kind of maybe going away from the faith. And he wouldn't say too much to them. And he would just kind of maintain the friendship, but wouldn't say too much. And then they would leave the faith. And then they obviously, whenever you leave the faith, it leads to real disaster, right? So these disasters would happen. And then they came back to him and they said to him, "Why didn't you tell me more?" When I was taking these first steps away, like, why didn't you say more to me? Why didn't you warn me? Right? Why didn't you kind of lay out a little bit more, like, what could happen to me? And so at that point, what he would do and what he would recommend to people to do is that, like, if you notice someone's in a like going down the wrong road or not in a great position, probably the best thing at some point is to invite the person. Obviously, there's a right way to do it, but to invite the person to let's have a serious conversation. I want to have a serious conversation. If you don't, fine, but if you're interested, I'd like to talk about some deeper things. And then he would do that, and then when the person would come to him, he would kind of lay everything out. I don't think you're in that great of a position. I think, if you continue down this path, X, Y, and Z might happen to you. This might not be so good for you. And obviously you can do it. There's nothing I can do to stop you. But I think you need to know this. And then if you do go down that path, keep in mind, there's the sacrament of confession. You can come back, right? Right? So he would, that I think was I think that approach is an approach where you realize, you come to the realization at some point, a perpetual dialogue might not be so good. And there does come a point where maybe we just have to say, this is where we are, and either I come to your position or you come to my position. Other than that, we can maintain friendly relations, but there might not be much more dialogue here. Because there is a danger. I think another critique of the Maritain approach is that if you maintain these kind of perpetual, if you're always in like this perpetual dialogue, what could end up happening is that all the influence ends up being one way. Because the other person actually is making distinctions where he's not going to let you influence. And so it might be better just to be transparent about it, to say, look, this is the disagreement. And it's better that we just acknowledge, like, these are the lines. And at some point one of us might cross, but these are the lines.